Imagine a nation where dozens of ethnicities, languages, and religions coexist under a fragile balance. For 35 years, Yugoslavia was held together by one man, Josip Broz Tito, a leader both revered and feared. Tito's iron grip prevented centuries-old rivalries from erupting into chaos. Behind the scenes, he carefully managed tensions, quelling nationalist movements before they could ignite, and orchestrating a complex federal system that kept the country united. But what happens when a towering figure who embodies a nation's unity suddenly disappears? In 1980, the death of Tito left Yugoslavia without a guiding hand. The carefully maintained equilibrium began to falter. Old grievances, suppressed for decades, resurfaced. Politicians and citizens alike were left asking, who would hold this mosaic of peoples together now? In this documentary, we will explore the rise of Tito, the extraordinary story of his rule, and the forces that ultimately unraveled the country he built. You will witness a nation's struggle to maintain peace amid diversity, the complex dance of politics and power, and the sparks that eventually ignited a tragic conflict. Join us as we journey through history to uncover the human stories behind the headlines, the bravery, the fear, and the ambitions that shaped Yugoslavia. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our deep dives into history's most compelling stories. Stay with us as we unravel the tale of a country that, despite its challenges, left an indelible mark on the world. Long before the world knew the name Josip Broz Tito, the lands that would become Yugoslavia were a patchwork of shifting borders, centuries of occupation, and layered identities, where the echoes of past empires still resonated in the hills, rivers, and cities. The Balkans were a crossroads, a region where East met West, and where cultures collided as much as they coexisted. For generations, Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bosnians, Montenegrins, and Macedonians lived under the shadow of great powers whose ambitions reshaped their lives in ways that would leave scars for centuries to come. The Ottoman Empire dominated the southern regions, bringing with it centuries of Islamic influence, administrative systems, and a complex hierarchy that intertwined with local customs, often exacerbating rivalries between communities that had coexisted uneasily for centuries. Meanwhile, to the north, the Habsburg monarchy extended its reach over territories that now form Slovenia, Croatia, and parts of Bosnia, imposing Catholic and later secular rule while seeking to integrate the region into the broader Central European framework. Yet the influence of these empires was never absolute, and the eastern edges of the Balkans remained under Russian sway at different points, each power leaving behind not only laws and armies, but a deep imprint on the identities and allegiances of the local populations. Families often found themselves split by faith and language, their loyalties tested by the shifting tides of conquest and political maneuvering. Historical grievances festered quietly, passed down through generations, sometimes erupting in open rebellion and other times simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to flare into violence. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in 1914, carried out by a young Bosnian Serb nationalist, was not merely an isolated act of terror, it was a spark set against a backdrop of centuries of simmering tension, emblematic of how deeply the past shaped the present in this fractured land. Within this intricate web of alliances and enmities, communities learned both resilience and suspicion. Markets, villages, and towns were alive with trade and shared cultural life, yet trust was fragile. Religious differences were often entwined with political allegiances, and the memory of past conflicts lingered in songs, stories, and local customs, reminding people that borders could change overnight and that today's neighbor could be tomorrow's adversary. This complex tapestry of coexistence and conflict created a landscape in which even the most visionary leaders faced nearly insurmountable challenges. It was into this world, steeped in centuries of uncertainty and rivalry, that Tito stepped, armed with the knowledge that managing not only the ambitions of leaders, but the hearts and minds of ordinary people would be the defining task of his rule. Understanding the depth of historical grievances was essential. Any attempt to unify the region had to acknowledge the past while trying to craft a shared future, a delicate balancing act that would define Yugoslavia for decades. The story of the Balkans before Tito is thus not only a story of conquest and empire but of the human capacity to adapt, survive, and yet remain haunted by historical memory. It is the story of how overlapping empires, shifting borders, and competing faiths forged a people who carried with them both a resilience born of necessity and a susceptibility to the forces of nationalism that would one day engulf their homeland. Every village square, every church and mosque, every language spoken along the rivers and mountainsides held traces of these centuries-long struggles, reminding us that to understand Yugoslavia, one must first understand the intricate, often turbulent history of the Balkans itself, a land where the past never truly rests and where memory shapes the possibilities of the future. As the shadows of World War I spread across Europe, the fragile fabric of Yugoslavia, already frayed by centuries of ethnic and religious tensions, was violently torn apart by the invading Axis powers. The rapid advance of German, Italian, and their allied forces swept through cities and villages, toppling governments and leaving communities vulnerable to occupation, violence, and the unpredictable whims of foreign rulers. It was in this crucible of chaos that Josip Broz Tito emerged not merely as a leader, but as a symbol of resistance and unification in a land long accustomed to division. He organized the communist partisans, a diverse and determined force composed of people from every corner of the fractured nation, united not past grievances but by a shared goal, to fight for freedom against the occupiers and, perhaps more perilously, against rival factions who sought to impose their own visions of the future. Among these rivals were the Chetniks, Serbian royalist militias intent on restoring the monarchy and safeguarding what they saw as an ethnically pure Greater Serbia, and the Ustash, Croatian fascists backed by Hitler and Mussolini, whose regime pursued a brutal campaign of ethnic cleansing, targeting Serbs, Jews, and Roma with ruthless precision. Tito and his partisans found themselves navigating a complex battlefield in which alliances shifted constantly and moral clarity was often obscured by the necessities of survival. In the forests and mountains of Yugoslavia, small bands of fighters orchestrated daring raids, sabotaged supply lines, and carried out guerrilla operations that confounded both foreign occupiers and domestic adversaries, slowly gaining the trust and support of ordinary citizens who had grown wary of oppression and exploitation. The partisans' struggle was not only military but deeply political, as Tito sought to demonstrate that unity across ethnic and religious lines was possible even amidst the chaos of war. His leadership emphasized inclusivity, strategic intelligence, and relentless determination, qualities that allowed the movement to expand rapidly and challenge the seemingly insurmountable power of the Axis occupiers. As the Allies observed the shifting tides of the conflict, they recognized the partisans' effectiveness and gradually shifted their support, providing crucial supplies and strategic backing that bolstered Tito's growing influence. Ordinary men and women, some barely out of childhood, found themselves drawn into the struggle, inspired by the vision of a Yugoslavia that could one day transcend the bitter divisions of the past. By the end of the war, Tito's partisans had not only fought off foreign domination, but also dismantled the structures of internal nationalist terror, establishing control over liberated territories and paving the way for a new political order. The Federal Republic Tito envisioned emerged from the devastation, a carefully structured union of 6 constituent republics designed to balance the interests of multiple ethnic groups while preventing the resurgence of old hostilities. The wartime crucible forged more than just a military victory. It had forged a leader whose reputation, charisma, and strategic brilliance would allow him to hold a diverse nation together for decades. Through relentless struggle, political acumen, and the courage of countless individuals who risked everything for the hope of a better future. The partisans transformed the wartime experience into the foundation of a federal Yugoslavia, laying the groundwork for Tito's extraordinary, though ultimately finite, experiment in unity. With the guns silenced and the dust of battle settling across Yugoslavia, Tito turned his attention from wartime leadership to the monumental task of rebuilding a nation that had been scarred by occupation, civil strife, and decades of historical tensions. His vision extended beyond mere reconstruction. He sought to forge a new socialist system unlike any seen in Eastern Europe, one that promised both economic growth and social cohesion while navigating the treacherous currents of Cold War politics. At the heart of this vision was the principle of self-management, an innovative approach that granted workers a measure of control over production, wages, and decision-making within factories and enterprises, allowing them to directly shape the economic life of their communities while fostering a sense of collective responsibility. Tito's Yugoslavia embraced industrialization with remarkable energy, transforming former agrarian villages into centers of manufacturing and infrastructure, linking remote regions with roads, railways, and communication networks, and integrating diverse communities into a shared economic framework. Alongside this industrial push, the country leveraged its stunning Adriatic coastline to develop tourism, turning towns like Tisno, Dubrovnik, and Split into destinations that drew millions of visitors from Western Europe and North America, bringing not only revenue but a cultural exchange that subtly reinforced the narrative of a unified Yugoslav identity. Tito's leadership projected a message to both citizens and the world. Yugoslavia was independent, modern, and capable of charting its own course, free from the dominance of either the Soviet Union or Western blocs, and it thrived in its position as a leader within the non-aligned movement, building relationships with emerging nations across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Yet beneath this veneer of prosperity and innovation, structural inequalities and tensions quietly persisted. The self-management system, while empowering in theory, often led to unintended consequences, with workers prioritizing immediate benefits over long-term sustainability. And regional disparities became increasingly visible as wealthier republics like Slovenia and Croatia accumulated advantages, while Bosnia, Kosovo, and Macedonia lagged behind, dependent on redistribution policies to balance the scales. These economic imbalances mirrored deeper social and ethnic fault lines, reminding citizens that the apparent unity of the post-war years was maintained not only through institutional innovation, but also through the firm hand of a centralized authority that monitored dissent and suppressed potential unrest. Tito's personality and style reinforced the system. He cultivated an image of accessibility and charisma, traveling aboard his yacht, the Galeb, entertaining world leaders and celebrities, and projecting an aura of sophistication that both legitimized his leadership and highlighted the country's achievements on the global stage. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens navigated the daily realities of state-subsidized goods, devalued currency, and fluctuating inflation, all carefully managed to maintain the perception of prosperity. Education, cultural programs, and international exchanges further promoted a Yugoslav identity that sought to transcend ethnic divisions, aiming to instill a sense of shared destiny across generations who had inherited centuries of historical grievances. In practice, Tito's model was a delicate balancing act. It combined economic experimentation, international diplomacy, and domestic control to produce a society that appeared unified, progressive, and open to the world, even as latent inequalities and unresolved historical animosities simmered beneath the surface. The Adriatic beaches teemed with tourists, factories hummed with production, and Yugoslav citizens experienced freedoms particularly in travel and cultural exchange unseen in neighboring Eastern Bloc countries. Yet the system required constant vigilance. political savvy, and the personal authority of Tito himself to hold it all together. In this complex interplay of innovation, control, and vision, the story of Tito's Yugoslavia emerges as both an economic and social experiment, a nation striving to reconcile diversity and modernity while navigating the persistent shadows of its turbulent past, and demonstrating how leadership, ideology, and circumstance converge to shape the destiny of an entire country. Beneath the surface of Yugoslavia's apparent prosperity and the flourishing of industry and tourism, a shadowed machinery of control operated quietly yet relentlessly, ensuring that Tito's vision of unity and stability remained unchallenged. The freedoms granted through self-management and cultural openness were tempered by a rigid political structure in which dissent, even in its mildest form, was swiftly and often invisibly suppressed. Central to this system was the network of prisons, the most notorious of which was Goliotok, the naked island, a remote and isolated outpost in the Adriatic Sea where those accused of opposing the state endured harsh conditions. Forced labor and psychological torment. Arriving at the island, prisoners were immediately thrust into a world of cruelty, required to pass through gauntlets of fellow inmates in ritualized violence, and then subjected to grueling work in stone quarries under relentless surveillance. The purpose was not merely punishment but also indoctrination and intimidation, a stark reminder that the state's authority extended to every corner of citizens' lives. Alongside the overt brutality of the camps, a subtler but equally pervasive network of secret police operated both within Yugoslavia and abroad, reaching communities as far away as Germany. Trained agents, often working under aliases, monitored, reported, and neutralized anyone deemed a threat to the regime. Journalists, political activists, and even exiled dissidents who dared to advocate for independence or criticize the government. Some of these operations ended in violent deaths, their perpetrators rarely brought to justice for decades, leaving families and communities haunted by mystery and fear, while the regime publicly projected an image of openness and progress. The reality behind closed doors was one of constant surveillance and the invisible threat of reprisal, a duality that shaped daily life and reinforced the centrality of Tito's authority. The suppression of dissent was intertwined with the broader political strategy of maintaining ethnic and regional balance. Tito's system relied on a careful distribution of power among republics and autonomous provinces. Yet the central government's oversight, backed by the ability to punish any deviation from party lines, ensured that no region or faction could act independently in a way that might destabilize the fragile federal framework. Those who challenged policies or questioned the allocation of resources often found themselves targeted, their voices silenced through imprisonment, forced labor, or exile. This environment fostered a climate of cautious compliance, where citizens understood that participation in political discourse required careful navigation, lest they attract the attention of the state's hidden eyes. Even as the country experienced impressive economic growth, tourism flourished, and an international reputation for neutrality and innovation took root. The reality of control was omnipresent. Ordinary Yugoslavs were keenly aware that the prosperity around them was closely guarded, and that public expressions of loyalty were expected, while private criticisms could carry dangerous consequences. For decades, this blend of innovation and repression shaped a society that appeared cohesive and forward-looking but rested upon a delicate balance of fear, authority, and ideological conformity. Tito's personal authority, charisma, and strategic intelligence allowed the state to maintain this equilibrium, enforcing compliance without the overt show of force typical of many other Eastern Bloc regimes. In examining this era, one sees that Tito's Yugoslavia was a nation of contrasts, dynamic and innovative on the surface, yet carefully policed and tightly controlled beneath. The story of Goliotok and the secret police underscores the human cost of maintaining unity in a multi-ethnic, post-war society still wrestling with centuries of division. It is a story of the intricate tension between progress and control, freedom and fear, revealing how one man's vision of a unified Yugoslavia relied not only on economic ingenuity and international diplomacy, but also on a formidable apparatus capable of silencing opposition at home and abroad, ensuring that the nation could move forward under the shadow of both promise and repression. By the 1970s, the veneer of prosperity in Yugoslavia began to show cracks that few had anticipated, and the carefully maintained balance of Tito's multi-ethnic federations started to tremble under the weight of economic and social pressures. For decades, the system of self-management had created the illusion of empowerment, yet it also concealed fundamental inefficiencies, as factory workers voted themselves wage increases without sufficient regard for reinvestment or long-term sustainability, leaving many enterprises underfunded and technologically behind. Inflation quietly eroded the purchasing power of ordinary citizens, while unemployment crept into the cities, particularly affecting those regions less favored by tourism or industrial development. The prosperity that had seemed evenly spread under Tito's guiding hand now appeared uneven and fragile, and the population began to sense the growing disparity between the republics. Wealthier regions like Slovenia and Croatia, buoyed by thriving industry and a booming Adriatic tourism sector, increasingly questioned why so much of their revenue had to be redistributed to support poorer areas such as Kosovo, Macedonia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina, sparking murmurs of resentment that Tito's strong personal authority had previously contained. As economic discontent grew, it began to intertwine with the latent national and ethnic tensions that had simmered for generations, surfacing most noticeably in the autonomous provinces and republics who saw the central government in Belgrade as both distant and overbearing. Calls for greater autonomy were no longer abstract political debates. They became tangible movements as local leaders and citizens demanded a greater share of power over their own economies and governance. In Kosovo, Albanian populations pressed for recognition as a full constituent republic, highlighting the long-standing grievances that had been masked under the rhetoric of unity. In Croatia, nationalist sentiment coalesced around the Croatian Spring, a political movement demanding greater control over the republic's wealth, culture, and educational system, reflecting a deeper desire to assert identity and protect local interests in the face of an increasingly centralized system that struggled to satisfy all its constituents. The federal government's responses were a mixture of suppression and reform, reflecting the dilemma of maintaining national cohesion while addressing legitimate grievances. Thousands of political activists, intellectuals, and local leaders were arrested or removed from positions of authority. A reminder that while Tito's Yugoslavia had pioneered a form of socialist self-management, the central government still wielded the power to enforce compliance through coercion. Simultaneously, constitutional reforms were introduced to grant greater autonomy to the republics and provinces. But these changes, rather than calming tensions, often highlighted the fragility of the federation. Economic inequalities persisted, and the perception that wealthier regions were subsidizing the poorer ones fueled a sense of injustice and division, reinforcing old resentments and creating new ones. Amid these pressures, ordinary citizens navigated an increasingly uncertain world, where opportunities for upward mobility were shadowed by rising costs of living and declining job security. The contrast between the coastal tourist hotspots and the struggling inland towns became increasingly stark, illustrating that Yugoslavia's post-war miracle had limits and that its economic model, once admired internationally, was beginning to strain under its own contradictions. Trade deficits and foreign debt compounded the sense of vulnerability, leaving the country dependent on external transfers and investments to sustain its everyday functioning. Within this context of mounting economic stress and growing political unrest, the threads of Yugoslavia's delicate fabric began to fray. The very mechanisms that had previously maintained unity, the centralized control, the careful ethnic balancing, and the suppression of dissent, could no longer fully mask the disparities and frustrations simmering across the republics. What had once been seen as a model of innovative socialist governance was increasingly exposed as a system struggling to reconcile competing economic needs, local ambitions, and the historical complexities of a region long defined by overlapping empires. Ethnic diversity and deep-seated historical grievances. By the close of the 1970s, it became clear that the stability of Tito's Yugoslavia, so long sustained by his vision and authority, was reaching a point of critical vulnerability, setting the stage for the turbulence that would follow in the decades to come. The death of Josip Broz Tito in 1980 left Yugoslavia without the guiding hand that had for decades managed to hold together a delicate tapestry of ethnicities, languages, and religions. And in the years that followed, the vacuum of leadership allowed long-suppressed tensions to resurface with alarming intensity. In Serbia, a figure emerged who understood the power of these historical grievances and skillfully harnessed them to consolidate his authority. Slobodan Milosevic, with a background in industry and banking, Milosevic entered the political scene with a keen sense of how nationalist sentiment could be wielded as a political tool, and he began to frame Serbian identity as under threat, particularly in regions like Kosovo where the majority Albanian population had long sought greater autonomy. Through calculated rhetoric and public appearances that invoked both historical memory and cultural pride, Milosevic painted a narrative of a Serbian people besieged and in need of a strong defender. And this message resonated deeply, igniting popular fervor and drawing supporters from across the republic. Meanwhile, in other republics, the story unfolded differently but no less dramatically, as decades of centralization and uneven economic development had left local populations increasingly dissatisfied with Belgrade's dominance. In Croatia and Slovenia, political movements advocating independence gained momentum, fueled by both economic disparities and the desire for cultural and political self-determination. These republics had long benefited from tourism and industrial growth, and they increasingly viewed the centralized redistribution of resources as a mechanism of constraint rather than support. Local leaders capitalized on this sentiment, framing independence not just as a political necessity, but as a restoration of historical identity and dignity, a reclaiming of agency that had been constrained under both the monarchy of the early 20th century and Tito's one-party socialist system. As these aspirations gained traction, the historical frictions that had been carefully managed for decades began to erupt, revealing the fragility of a federal system built more on personal authority than on enduring institutional cohesion. Ethnic and cultural identities, once coexisting under Tito's rigid management, now became potent tools of mobilization, and old grievances that had been suppressed or contained by the central government came to the fore. In towns and cities across the republics, symbols of the past were the local heroes, historical anniversaries, or contested monuments became rallying points for communities asserting their distinct identities. The tension was compounded by economic instability, as inflation, unemployment, and the uneven distribution of wealth intensified perceptions of injustice, particularly in regions that felt marginalized or exploited by federal policies. The combination of historical memory, economic grievance, and political opportunity created a combustible environment where decades of latent hostility could ignite into open confrontation. As Milosevic's influence grew, he skillfully intertwined political ambition with nationalist sentiment, framing himself as the indispensable guardian of Serbian interests, while the republics of Croatia and Slovenia moved toward formal declarations of sovereignty. Public demonstrations, political assemblies, and even cultural events became arenas where the competing narratives of ethnic pride and historical justice were expressed with increasing vehemence, and the population, previously unified under a collective Yugoslav identity, found itself divided along the very lines that Tito had so assiduously sought to manage. Across the country, suspicion, resentment, and fear became everyday experiences, as neighbors questioned loyalties and historical rivalries resurfaced. From memory of wartime atrocities to the uneven treatment of republics under federal policies. In this climate, the fragile federal institutions struggled to respond, as decision-making required consensus among leaders increasingly invested in the promotion of their own republic's interests. The mechanisms that had once mediated conflicts, the collective presidency, rotating leadership, and central party control proved insufficient in the face of rising nationalist fervor. What had been a multi-ethnic federation now faced the stark reality of fragmentation, with each republic asserting its priorities and identity, often in direct opposition to the perceived interests of others. The echoes of history, long contained, now dictated the rhythm of contemporary politics, as the old wounds of empire, war, and suppression reasserted themselves in new forms, setting the stage for the violent unraveling of Yugoslavia. The nation that Tito had painstakingly forged was unraveling, not because of a sudden event, but because decades of unresolved tensions, economic inequality, and political opportunism had created conditions where the past could no longer remain buried, and where the future seemed increasingly uncertain, threatening to drag the Balkans into a conflict that history had long foreshadowed. As the 1980s drew to a close, the cracks in Yugoslavia's once tightly controlled structure had widened into deep chasms, and the pressures of economic hardship combined with resurgent nationalism to create an environment ripe for upheaval. Inflation had skyrocketed, unemployment was rampant, and the uneven distribution of wealth between republics fanned long-standing resentments. In regions like Slovenia and Croatia, citizens increasingly viewed Belgrade's policies as oppressive, while leaders in these republics capitalized on local pride and historical memory to push for greater autonomy and, ultimately, full independence. Meanwhile, in Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic continued to consolidate power by stoking fears of Serbian marginalization and invoking the symbolic weight of Kosovo and other historical narratives, rallying supporters with fiery speeches that warned of cultural and political threats. By 1990, the tensions that had been simmering under the surface erupted into public conflict. Riots broke out, fueled by both economic despair and ethnic hostility, often starting in small towns and escalating quickly as historical grievances flared. In Croatia, political shifts brought Franjo Tudman and the nationalist Croatian Democratic Union to power, signaling a decisive move toward independence. Slovenia followed suit, holding votes to assert sovereignty, while Bosnia and Herzegovina found itself caught in the middle, its ethnically mixed population divided along lines that mirrored decades of conflict. Sporting events, like the infamous 1990 football match between Dinamo Zagreb and Red Star Belgrade, turned violent, symbolizing the larger societal fracture as fans clashed in displays of ethnic and regional loyalty, a microcosm of the divisions tearing the country apart. The federal government, weakened by years of economic mismanagement and the absence of strong leadership after Tito, struggled to respond. The mechanisms that had once kept Yugoslavia united collective presidencies, rotating leadership, and centralized oversight were no longer effective against the surge of nationalist fervor. Independence declarations from Slovenia and Croatia were met with resistance from Serbia, sparking military interventions and armed confrontations. Ethnic militias, former partisans, and paramilitary groups became embroiled in the ensuing violence, each seeking to assert dominance, protect communities, or exact revenge for historical atrocities. The fragile balance Tito had maintained for decades disintegrated almost overnight, replaced by fear, and widespread suffering. By the early 1990s, the dream of a unified Yugoslavia had been shattered. Cities were besieged, families displaced, and entire communities destroyed in what became one of the most tragic chapters of late 20th century European history. The country that had once appeared as a model of socialist innovation and multi-ethnic coexistence now lay fractured. With scars that continue to shape the Balkans today, the lessons are stark. Unchecked nationalism, economic inequality, and political opportunism can dismantle even the most carefully constructed state, and the consequences are felt for generations. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Yugoslavia's history. If you found this story insightful and compelling, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share our channel for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. Your support helps us bring history to life, explore complex narratives, and connect the past with the present. Do not miss out on our upcoming videos. Hit that notification bell so you are always updated on the next chapter of history we uncover together.